All right, welcome back. So maybe you are catching up on this after a few days, or maybe you're watching this like one after the other. You're deciding to binge watch this entire training, whatever it is. Welcome back. Thank you so much for joining me. Now I'm going to talk about the misconceptions and fears that I see a lot of the time inside the mom groups, or when I'm talking about home birth, or the fact that you can have a natural birth without anybody touching you. A lot of times people are like, well, I need to get to the hospital by a certain point because something's going to go wrong. This is going to address some of the most common fears. I also talk about this inside your Empowered Birth Academy, which is my deeper dive training program on finding the loopholes and being able to navigate the medical system. Not only that, but spotting those natural birth traps so that you don't have to just refer to a list, but you can actually see, because there's so many more traps than what I've listed. In fact, there's so many nuances to those traps. So you really have to recognize by tuning into yourself. I talk about getting past your fear at a deeper level. I talk about getting your care provider I talk about getting your partner on board with your birth plan and getting them to become your champion. And I also talk about getting your care provider on board. So there's a lot of advocacy skills, there's a lot of skills for communication, there's a lot of skills for releasing fears, but it's just too much to go into for a training such as this. So that's a deeper dive. If you want to go deeper, I will talk about that later in this program. But first, I'm just going to let you know that when you're having a true natural birth, you need to ignore 90% of the information about natural birth that's out there. And the reason for this, as I talked about in the previous video, is that it's you're usually falling into a natural birth trap by doing that. You're falling into the idea that birth is painful, birth is traumatic, birth goes wrong, you need a medical professional, and it's ingrained into our culture of fear. So everything is based on fear. It's profit, convenience, liability on the medical side, but it's also a lot of fear in our birth culture that has led to this misconception that you can't have the kind of birth that you really want. And I mentioned earlier that if you happen to be having twins and one of them's breech and you're on your way to the hospital to have your C-section, and all of a sudden you go into labor and babies come quick, you could end up having a VBAC with breech and twins. I've seen this. I've seen this actually happen. There's a video out there. Just send me a message if you want me to pull that up for you, and I'll pull it out. But the idea is that all these things happen all the time. Like you're like, oh, I'm afraid to have a car birth. Well, what if you weren't afraid? So I'm going to share some misconceptions with you. Maybe you've already heard of them, and it's going to debunk a lot of myths. There's so many more out there. In fact, Gentle Birth Choices and the Positive Birth Book and Reclaiming Childbirth as a Rite of Passage, like pretty much all of these books behind me, they have some form of debunking these myths. But just for the purposes of this session, I wanted to make sure that we address the big ones. Okay, so let's get started. All right, we're going to start with the big one here. I don't go into labor on my own. So you may have heard this quite often, especially in mom groups where moms are like, I don't go into labor on my own. I've always had inductions and I really want to have a natural birth this time. And the truth is that you don't want to push yourself into labor. You don't want to try to get into labor before your due date, because 95% of babies are born spontaneously, meaning on their own, by 42 weeks, with 5% coming anywhere from 43 to 45 weeks. So it's only about 5% of the population where you might be a very late gestator. And if that's running in your family, then that's just the way it is. So yeah, maybe you don't go into labor on your own by 41 weeks, but you will at 42 weeks. You'll never know that if you're constantly getting forced into an induction at 41 weeks, or if you're trying to stress your body out to get into labor earlier than that because you're trying to avoid an induction. A lot of the things that moms do to try to get into labor, they don't actually work, as you're going to find out as I go deeper into this training. And in session number 3, I'm going to talk more about this in induction. But as long as your baby is doing well and as long as you're doing well, there's really no reason to evict them. Yeah, I know it's uncomfortable to be pregnant at the end, like near the end. I know that you are wanting to hold your baby. And at the same time, if you try to rush this process, it's like picking at the flower buds of a flower to try to make it bloom faster. It's not going to work. It's just going to ruin the flower. So, will you go into labor on your own? Yes, you absolutely will. Everybody goes into labor on their own. It's just a matter of where in the timeline you really are. And wherever you are in that timeline is right for you and right for your baby. Now, there are sometimes things that can lead to labor not starting when it's supposed to. And one of those is that baby's just not ready. They're just not ready to come. Or it can be stress related. So, say a care provider happens to be putting a lot of pressure on you and telling you that you need to have an induction, and now you're freaking out and you're anxious. Your body is going to be like, right. So, we were going to go into labor, we were going to have the baby, but now we're going to slow things down because it's just not safe. So, you need to recognize that is that you will go into labor on your own when you feel safe, when you feel supported, when your baby is ready. And if you have signs of labor already starting, like you have a lot of prodromal labor, which we'll talk about later in this session, then that can be an indicator that it's stress related or it's fear related that's keeping baby from coming. Or maybe they're just not in a good position yet and they just need some more time to shift. In which case, yeah, prodromal labor sucks. My daughter put me through it. And also think of it as your uterus warming up and moving baby into a better position so that when labor actually gets going, it goes fast. So, in the same vein as not going into labor on your own is the thought that you don't dilate. And your cervix is a sphincter, which means that it will not open if you feel tense and afraid. This is nature's way of preventing you from birthing if there's a predator in the area. So if you're not dilating, it's because you're stressed out, being induced, and baby's not even ready, or the medical staff aren't even giving you time. The idea that you need to dilate 1 centimeter per hour is based on Friedman's curve. And Friedman was a doctor back in the 1950s who had gotten this idea that every woman needs to dilate 1 centimeter per hour. Now, here's the problem with that. Every single one of his patients was in that study. This was not a study done with a wide sample or with anybody else. It was within his hospital, his practice, and everybody had Pitocin. So then they go and base this on everybody. So this study is already flawed in multiple different ways because it's going with a specific population that is all within his practice, that he's doing interventions to get them to dilate 1 centimeter per hour, and he's using Pitocin. This is not true natural birth. So you are not going to necessarily dilate 1 centimeter per hour, and not giving you time or saying, oh, you're only at 6 centimeters or you're at 9 centimeters and you've been at 9 centimeters the whole time. Your cervix is not a crystal ball. Okay. So this is part of what I recognized is that when I was 6 centimeters dilated, because I was like, I need to know what's going on. I've been in labor for almost 24 hours. When we found out I was 6 centimeters, but nothing was really moving forward, you think 6 centimeters is supposed to be active labor. That's what they talk about. Is like 6 centimeters is active labor or 4 centimeters is active labor. No, because if you start to feel tense and afraid, or the check happens to be really painful, in which case it was for me, labor will shut down. Your cervix opens and it closes. It opens and it closes when you are ovulating. At certain points of your cycle, you are actually having your cervix change. And this is something that I noticed even with fertility. If you check your fertility, if you're planning on having another baby in the future, then just pay attention to what your cervix is doing, because your cervix will open up a lot wider, closer to the point where you are fertile, and close up tight when you're not. And it will open again when you're menstruating. So your cervix opens and it closes, and it's based on your stress levels. It's based on where you are in your hormones. It's based on maybe practice. If your body is practicing opening up, but it's not quite ready yet, baby's not quite ready to come, but you're like, but I'm 4 centimeters dilated and I haven't had any signs of labor yet, but I'm 4 centimeters dilated. So how do I get things going? You don't. You don't. And if you're completely closed up, that doesn't mean you're not going to open. If you're completely closed up at 41 weeks, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're never going to go into labor. You could be 1 centimeter and go up to 10 very quickly. So your cervix is not a crystal ball. You will dilate. It's not a matter of if you'll dilate, it's a matter of when and how often, like, you're going to see that progress. But you don't actually need to follow the progress. You just follow your body. My pelvis is too small. This is another one that my friend and mentor, Gloria LeMay, she has this quote, and it's, there are two kinds of pelvises, ample, and you can fit a pony through there, honey. So if you're really wanting to understand more about the female pelvis, I do have a video on that that I can show you. If you want to know more about it, I can drop that resource. You can send me a message. But the idea is that the female pelvis is not fused. It is not the same thing as the male pelvis. So it's not bone, it's cartilage. The pubic bone is cartilage, and the joints are going to loosen closer to when you are birthing. This is also why SPD, symphysis pubis dysfunction, is a thing, which basically means that your joints are really, really loose and it can hurt to walk. That just means that you've got a lot of space in your pelvis right now and it's moving those joints. So that's a good thing with some side effects because it is kind of painful. I've had SPD. It's not fun, but it's not going to affect your ability to have a natural birth. In fact, it's going to make it easier for you to have that natural birth. On the other hand, restrictive positions, such as being on your back with your legs in the air, or even just having your legs wide apart instead of having your knees in and legs out, is what leads to babies getting stuck. It's not the size or shape of your pelvis. So this is one of the biggest lies that undermine your confidence to birth, and many OBs will perpetuate this myth rather than examine their own way of supporting birth. So, I mean, if you've got a whole bunch of OBs and generations of women who have been put on their backs to birth, which was based off of, and I'm not kidding on this, a French king in the 1600s who basically said, I get jollies from watching my mistresses and my wife give birth. So I want to see it, but I can't see it very clearly on the birth stool. So I want her on her back with her legs in the air, spread wide apart, so I can see the baby coming out. And then, of course, the nobility is like, ooh, so that's the way that queens and the king's mistresses give birth. That must be the most fashionable, safest way to do it. And then they started doing that. And then in the 20th century, in the 19th century, of course, around the Industrial Revolution, Chamberlain, another doctor, basically invented the forceps. And the forceps was designed to pull out babies that got stuck. Now, why did the babies get stuck? Because there was a lot of women that had rickets. There were women that had like smaller pelvises because they were also very young. And there's also the issue that they were all on their backs. So babies would get stuck. So they'd pull these babies out with forceps. And then you go into the medical system and you recognize, oh, everybody's on their back. Everybody's having their babies pulled out with forceps. And now there's this myth that our pelvises are too small. It's not that our pelvises are too small. I am 110 pounds soaking wet. I had 8-pound babies. There are women that are smaller than me who have had 10-pound babies at home. There are women that are about the same size of me that have had 11-pound babies at home, and it's been a VBAC or a home birth after cesarean. So when you look at that, when you really recognize your pelvis is not too small, if your OB is telling you that, that's a red flag. They don't understand true natural birth. You want to stay away from people that tell you your pelvis is too small. It's undermining your confidence. Here's another one, a misconception when it comes to the medical system itself. They won't let me or I'm not allowed. So what you need to understand is that the policies and preferences of the medical system have nothing to do with your actual ability to birth without medical intervention. In fact, it is against your legal human rights to be forced into any medical procedure, regardless of whether it is life-saving for you or for your baby. You have the right to informed consent and refusal. So don't let them treat you like a child. There is a blog article that was written years ago by Kristen Pascucci of Birth Monopoly that basically says, you're not allowed to not allow me. And it's true, is that you have the right to informed consent and refusal. I teach a lot about navigating the medical system because, yes, it can seem very confronting to try to advocate for yourself, especially when there's a lot of fear put on you. That's why inside of your Empowered Birth Academy, I also talk about the fear release techniques, and I talk about getting your partner to become your hero and seeing those loopholes in the medical system, and then also going and navigating your care provider's fear so that they will support you. Now, this isn't to say that there aren't some people out there. I'm not going to label them. However, they're the kinds of people who do not like it when you question their authority. And because of their ego, they don't like to be challenged. And because of their personality, that challenge can be met with pushback and met with violence. There is a term that has been coined in the birth community called obstetric violence. And this is basically, there's a whole triangle of that. If you want to learn more about that, go to birthmonopoly.com and check out the triangle about obstetric violence. It's Kristen Pascucci's own design. I'm not going to share it here, but if you do want access to it and you want to understand more, you can always reach out to me if you're having trouble finding it, but it's usually pretty easy to find. You could probably even Google it. But the idea is that there's gaslighting and then there's actual violence being done. And don't worry, inside of this program, in the Empowered Birth Workshop, I do teach you how to spot those red flags. So you won't be hiring those kinds of people. But you need to recognize you're not a child. And the idea that the medical system is the authority, it needs to go. If you want to have a true natural birth experience, you're going to have to find a different way of playing your game instead of the medical system's game of you're not allowed to have food or drink, or you're not allowed to be off your back, or you're not allowed to go past 40 weeks, or you're not allowed to have a VBAC, whatever it is, they're not allowed to not allow you. And that leads into I'm high risk, I have to. First of all, always question the high risk label, because often it's based on fear, control, liability, and inflated numbers for risks. I'm talking about the risk of stillbirth when they say, oh, risk of stillbirth doubles after 40 weeks gestation. And it's like, yeah, it goes from 1 per 1,000 to 2 per 1,000 after 41 weeks. And then it goes to like 3 per 1,000 if you go past 42 weeks. It's not that big of a number. Or when they talk about uterine rupture rates, it's less than 1%. But nobody will talk about that because they're inflating those risks because of the fact that if that disastrous outcome does happen, it's a big lawsuit. It's a big liability issue. It hikes up the insurance rates and it can get care providers in trouble. They suddenly have an inquiry. Why did this happen? Well, the client said no. Well, why? What did you say to them? If you recognize, though, that at the end of the day, you are the one birthing this baby, and you are the one who can intuitively recognize if and when you need to interfere, then that high risk label isn't as scary. It doesn't nullify your rights to informed consent and refusal. In fact, I've had clients who have been incredibly high risk, such as having gestational diabetes, type 1 diabetes, previous C sections, previous multiple C sections, previous history of preeclampsia, chronic high blood pressure, like anything you can think of. If you're not afraid, if you're like, yes, I know the risks. However, I'm going to aim for this true natural birth and I'm going to create my backup plans around these risk factors that I have, then that allows you to still have the kind of birth that you want. And maybe you take on one or two interventions, but it's not the whole thing. You're not taking on the high risk mom birth package where you're hooked up to an IV and the monitors and you have a highly medicalized birth. You don't have to do anything. And that's a good place to stop. So if you do want to go deeper with this, though, as I said, you can check out some of the other videos on my YouTube channel. You can check out some of the success stories of some of my previous clients. In fact, one in particular is one of my favorites, is a mom who had type 1 diabetes. She had had a C-section before. She said, I'm having a home birth this time. And she did it with an 11-pound baby. So again, like she was the epitome of high risk. And she managed to have this beautiful birth experience because she was able to get past her fear, which is why with the Empowered Birth Workshops, module number 1, of course, is all about getting past fear. And then we go into understanding about how natural birth works, how to navigate the induction traps. Then we're going to go into creating your birth plan and writing it effectively. And then we finish off with a little bit about your care provider and understanding the red flags and advocating for yourself in the medical system. It's just a very brief overview, and also understanding about why your partner is resisting your home birth so that maybe we can turn that around. And by the end of that, there's also a deeper dive training that you can access. If you bought it as a bundle, you already have it. If you don't, you can always reach out to me. I will tell you more about Empowered Birth Academy later in this program. And for now, though, I just want you to recognize that there's so many misconceptions about natural birth and what you're allowed to have. So many people will say that you can only have a home birth if you're not high risk, but otherwise you have to go to the hospital. But, sometimes moms have been so traumatized by their birth in the hospital and they are high risk, but they just can't step foot in there anymore. They just can't. They're like, I want to have a home birth at all costs. And that's where the idea that, oh, you can only have a home birth if you're low risk is a problem in our culture, because you should be able to birth wherever you want, whenever you want, with whomever you want. And you shouldn't be put into a box that tells you that, oh, no, you don't fit into this box, so you can't have it. That's how I got tricked the first time, because I had a baby that was too small for dates and I was told I couldn't have a home birth, but I really could have if I'd known this. So in the next part of this training, though, I'm going to be sharing some secrets. In the meantime, if you want to go and look over your workbook, if you want to write some extra notes and some takeaways, you can do that. If you want to go get a glass of water, take a pause from these videos and maybe come back to them in a day or two, you can do that as well. And when you come back, I'll see you in the next training.